Hi everybody, welcome into our lesson video for week 3. Today's topic is getting into the concept or the idea that learning takes place in conversation and in community with other like-minded people who are asking questions similar to you, making arguments connected to topics that you're interested in, evaluating information and details in a community environment, rather than this idea that can be really popular in American Western culture, this obsession with individualism and independence, which can get us very far, and those things are important. But when it comes to higher education and deeper learning, it is essential to see yourself within a community, having a conversation, sitting at a table with similar like-minded or similarly invested adult people. So that's a little preview of our theme for today. Before we get started, I'm going to remind everybody to check in with themselves, see how they're feeling, gauge your attention at this moment, gauge your emotional well-being at this moment, and really see if right now is the best time for you to set aside 45 to 60 minutes to learn, think, take notes, ask questions, share your own insights and thoughts. Please don't be tempted to just turn on the video at 2 times speed and let it play while you scroll on your phone, because while you might catch on to some ideas that you otherwise wouldn't have, that's not going to really serve you best as a student. All right, so that's enough out of me. Without any further ado, I'm going to jump in. Pause here if you need to get yourself prepared, set up your workspace, get a beverage, get a note-taking tool ready, and meet me in the lesson when you're ready to engage. All right, today's lesson is learning in community, learning how to add your voice into a larger ongoing conversation. During this lesson, the topics that we're going to get into include reminders for course context, so how this lesson fits within Project 1 and the other projects of the course. Understanding what is known as the rhetorical situation. So this is a phrase that has been popping up in our lessons, readings, in our conversations as a class. And today we're going to take a really close look at the meaning of that new term. We're going to look at this metaphor that I like to introduce to help us really picture and connect with the idea of learning in community, learning as something that takes place in conversation. So the metaphor that I like is taking a seat at the table, and we're going to look through that metaphor step by step, starting with checking in what's already in your bag, something we alluded to in our previous lesson about critical thinking, self-evaluation, understanding assumptions. So this is a big part of Project 1, where we're exploring what we're bringing with us into the project. Approaching the table. So before you just jump into a conversation, you do need to get a feel for the situation, read the room, figure out, first of all, which table you even want to come sit at, listening into the discussion, finding, or sometimes it's necessary to create a seat for yourself. So finding a seat at that table, whether there's one open for you or whether you need to open it for your viewpoints to be added to that conversation. And then joining the conversation, what this looks like in academic terms, conceptually and practically. And then finally, taking a look back at this academic technique of synthesis and response. So we're going to explore the metaphor of taking a seat at the table, but really we want to understand with clarity what we're doing is synthesizing our research and responding to it in context. So we're going to conclude the lesson with some grounding in that academic language. Please remember that everybody is expected to take notes, take charge of your learning. Passive listening might help you to understand this information right now, today, but taking notes will set you up for success to practice these skills when we do our writing assignments, to practice these skills in your other classes, and to see the way that today's lessons fit in with the notes you've taken previously from what you've read and what you've watched. Learning leaders, please remember that at some point at the end of the week, share your 3, 2, 1 takeaway insights and deep thinking questions into the collaborative Google Doc. And please reach out to me if you need any support or guidance with that. I can work with you one-on-one to get you in the right direction. And without any further ado, let's jump in. The first thing we're going to look at is course context. So bringing us into Project 1, the research proposal. So when we are proposing our research topic, what we really want to do is contextualize your project, your topic, and your ideas within a wider and ongoing conversation amongst many sources. So right here in the proposal phase, we don't need to know what those sources are necessarily. We don't need to do any research. What we do need to do is say right away from the beginning, I want to join a conversation that includes research. And this is different from previous general education. What do you call it? You don't call it lower ed. Like K-12 type education, where our essays are all about like, here's my argument and my supporting reasons why, or recognizing in favor versus opposed, like a black and white debate. As higher education learners, as we're getting ready to learn the skills that we need to transfer into the university, transfer into our eventual upper division coursework, or transfer into the professional field where you might be playing a significant role in a company or a business, what we want to do when we pitch our ideas is to right away give context and say, I want to join a conversation that's already in progress. I want to add my ideas to this larger community-wide discussion. So it's a more sophisticated, more mature than just saying, here's what I think, and these are the reasons why. We want to, in the proposal phase, we want to persuade the audience that this problem really is significant, or this change that we're advocating for really will make a significant impact. We kind of want to already start proving that what we want to contribute is valuable, worthy of attention, resources, and effort. Also in the proposal phase, when we're just pitching our topic, we want to start persuading that reader to adopt those changes, to really begin to think about shifting their mindset, changing the way they act and behave, changing the kinds of policies that they advocate for. So even though we're not doing research yet, we're not writing our argument yet, we need to begin with those long-term goals in mind so that we have momentum. In other words, in the proposal phase, we want to provide some context so that we can elevate our viewpoint or our opinion into the status of a more powerful argument. One of the objectives for this course, English C1001, is to respond appropriately to texts with attention to audience, purpose, and social context. So already we're seeing that the goal of academic writing is responding to these complex layers. So in other words, where is this going? In other words, in order to have our argument taken seriously, we need to show the readers that we've done our homework, that we've understand the context, and that we've considered alternate perspectives. And above all else, we want to show that our personal viewpoint really does add something significant and valuable to the discussion or to the mission that is already underway. So in other words, as we begin to propose our research topic, we already want to frame this as joining an ongoing conversation. So when you propose your research topic, begin the planning process with momentum toward the final destination. Remember the 3 projects in this class. The proposal will show the significance of your topic for yourself, for other potential alternate viewpoints, etc. The research phase is going to help you explore, evaluate, and analyze multiple perspectives, including some perspectives that support your argument and some perspectives that you will argue against. And then the argument phase will help to persuade the reader into actually transforming themselves or transforming the systems and structures that they connect with. When you propose a research topic, you want to show how that topic connects to your life, how that topic is part of a larger conversation amongst multiple sources, and how that topic has impacts and consequences for the real world. So right away, we're building the framework, we're building the map that is going to guide us through to the end of the year. So let's take a moment here to pause and see if we have questions. By this time in our coursework, we've already introduced the prompt for the research proposal. We've brainstormed topics that might fit in. We've drafted a little bit of personal narratives to kind of ground our connection. And throughout the rest of the week, we're going to expand our personal viewpoints to also consider alternate perspectives. We're going to learn how to elevate our opinions into the status of an argument using academic techniques. And we're going to start drafting paragraphs that express our own viewpoints and anticipate the viewpoints of others. The text on this slide didn't fully save, so sorry about that. But at this point, reach out if there are things that you don't understand. If you're feeling a little bit lost or confused, that's perfectly natural. Learning is not something that just happens in a straight line. Learning is something that we kind of loop back and forth through. So don't hesitate to reach out and say, I'm feeling a little lost. Can you explain this more? Can I share with you what I understand and you let me know if I'm on the right path? Whatever the case may be, reach out for support if you're not feeling clear in where we are so far in the course. And now let's jump into the lesson. We want to take a deep dive into the rhetorical situation, and that is this relationship between purpose, audience, and context. So the rhetorical relationship refers to this concept that meaning is created when content enters a relationship of expectations, reactions, lasting impressions for the creator, so like the author or the person who produces it, the consumer, the reader, the audience, and the wider social context. And we will dive deep into context next week. So that's still kind of abstract for us, but keep it in mind, we're on our way there. So often the rhetorical situation is presented in this graphic map where meaning is something that is controlled and influenced by the relationships between the content itself, along with the purpose that the creator had in mind, the context in which it is received, and the audience or the consumer who is actually interpreting the information. And within this relationship, we realize that meaning does not exist within the content or the media or the message alone. Meaning is actually created within this rhetorical relationship. The creator themselves has a purpose. They are creating this message in order to impact consumers, in order to impact the larger context in some specific way. And as we write, we want to have a clear idea of what our purpose is. When we're reading later in the course and we get into research, we want to infer what was that author's purpose within this rhetorical situation. And we also see that the meaning and the impact of a text or of any kind of media or message shifts in connection with real world communities, cultures, and conditions. So this is something that we recognize when we see things from the past that once were like socially accepted, and now we recognize them as highly problematic for many context areas, like social context, environmental context, economic, everything, health. So the meaning of something changes based on its relationship to different context. And also the audience. As an audience member, you are free to determine which messages that you're going to accept, reject, negotiate with, and shift the context of. So the audience or the reader has a huge impact on the actual meaning. And that's something for you to keep in mind when you're addressing your own audience when you write your final argument. In other words, taking that big bite of vocabulary and connections, in order to communicate effectively, I should engage with the changing, incomplete, and messy relationship between the words that I want to say and how they might feel to potential listeners and how they might feel within today's context area. In other words, when I want to communicate my message effectively, I need to really join into a larger community, into an ongoing discussion. I don't want to come out like all on my own, not having read the room, not knowing any of the context cues, and just start saying my argument. I want to take into consideration this relationship that I'm entering into anytime I produce a message. We can look at this a little more deeply in the context of the course, in the context of Project 1. So when we're looking at our purpose in general, we want to begin with the end in mind. So what do we want to do? Do we want to deconstruct harmful or toxic norms? Are we trying to advocate for innovations and changes? Are we influencing real world beliefs, actions, and policies? Like, what do we want to accomplish? If I know my ultimate goal and my ultimate why, then I can focus my energy and my attention toward taking the smaller steps toward that finish line. In writing, what this kind of looks like is researching with the purpose in mind. So defining and describing your topic, understanding the keywords and concepts around that topic, summarizing the big questions and the big goals that people have within the topic you're entering, gathering multiple perspectives. So trying to get a mixture of everyday people, everyday communities, like people on social media, people just sharing their views, commercial, corporate, or marketing type parties. This is kind of any media that has ads attached to it, more or less. Political, legal, and government bodies, they'll have their own take on the topic. They'll have their own goals, purposes, keywords. Medical or technical specialists, scholarly, academic, and scientific studies. So research in mind that you want to join the larger conversation, that you want to pick some perspectives from across the board of different kinds of perspectives. You want to take in the scope of the discussion. So what have been some of the historical assumptions and the historical ideas versus the more recent questions, problems, debates? Where do we see this conversation taking place across different forms of media, writing, speech, audiovisual artworks, imagery. Sometimes we might include an object as part of our analysis and research. Sometimes we might do observations to observe behaviors and things like that as part of our research. And we want to work toward an argument that eventually fills our purpose, the purpose that we have in mind. So that is persuading and influencing your audience to evaluate and critique problems, advocate for changes and solutions, analyze the impacts and consequences, and influence the thoughts, feelings, and choices of your eventual reader. So right now, when we're proposing our work, we want to see ourselves as joining into a conversation in order to solve problems, make changes, and persuade the next readers. These ideas will help you as you're anticipating the conversation, anticipating the kind of research you need to do. Along with purpose, we also have to contemplate our audience. So in general, we want to imagine and keep in our minds the community that we're joining. So who is invested in this topic? Whose lives are really being touched by these themes? Who is possibly being harmed by these problems, or who might be benefiting from these systems? And within this conversation, what do different community members have in common? And where do different community members seem to disagree or take different paths? If I know who I wish to speak with, it can really help me imagine the kinds of sources I should try to find and the kinds of arguments that I should try to develop. What does this look like? So when we're considering our audience, we want to tailor our research goals to persuade an intended audience, rallying together by joining people who share our experiences, concerns, missions, and goals. Or instead of speaking within your community, you might speak on behalf of your community to confront opponents by challenging harmful viewpoints and assumptions, by demanding systemic changes. Or perhaps you want to take a more informative stance, though be careful. In this course, the goal is a persuasive argument. So the sharing information is very effective, but it needs to be in order to persuade. But you might want to inform invested groups about the unknown role that they could be playing within the issue. So perhaps you want to say, by doing these things, you don't realize that you are accepting these systems and these patterns, or by doing these things, you don't realize that you're causing harms, or by doing these things, you might not realize it, but you're making real change and you're making real progress. So informing invested communities about the consequences of their actions and perhaps how they might change their awareness, their behaviors, their choices. If you intend to address an audience through a critical thinking mindset, all along the way, you might be trying to stir up critical thinking questions that really help to evaluate the topic and raise this discussion up to a higher level. You want to bring your audience into the conversation by addressing a reader from your own point of view in order to really cultivate this really humanizing, connecting relationship. We don't want to can address our audience in a way that might perpetuate stereotyping or leave empathy behind, realizing that human beings are reading whatever it is that we write, and human beings are chaotic, messy, flawed, imperfect, and they know it. So being sensitive when you're trying to tell people oh, you're doing something wrong and you should change it, or being realistic when you're proposing how they should alter the way that they live in the world. You also want to bring into a sense of community by joining together us and them language. If you are rallying together with people who share the same mission, using words like we and us against they and them is one way to help persuade and influence. Similarly to if you're confronting opponents, you would want to say, like, you all, when you're doing these harmful things, are hurting us. My community, we are impacted. And using that kind of personalized language can go a long way in connecting with the audience and persuading them. Of course, I'm not trying to say that we should like manipulate our audience, but in some ways, learning how to write persuasively does involve a little bit of this attention to how the audience is going to receive it and the choices that we can make to increase the persuasiveness of our writing. So in other words, why isn't this clicking? So in other words, joining the community, solving problems and making changes and persuading the next reader. So along with our purpose and our audience, we need to understand the context. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we will have a whole lesson devoted to this, but it's something we can already begin thinking about. And that is, we want to focus on the big picture. We want to understand underlying or hidden values and norms that are attached to our viewpoint within the topic, as well as we can imagine what underlying values and norms are attached to alternative viewpoints. We want to dig into real world consequences, and we can do that by thinking about how this topic impacts system level or structural patterns that we see in the world. And if I know how my topic impacts the real world context, then I really can tailor my analysis and tailor my argument with a clear focus. Remember, we're joining ongoing discussions, we're proposing changes to solve problems, and we are trying to make a real world impact. At least we're trying to practice those things in English C1001. And what might this look like practically on the writing, research, thinking level? Understand the context areas that impact your topic. Infer the hidden values, norms, and expectations that are carried within various perspectives and arguments, including your own. Imagine the extended consequences and impacts that might result from those perspectives. Link those values into thematic areas like psychology, society, culture, politics, history, which also includes ideas about the future, aesthetics, gender, ethnicity, ability, economics, environment, symbolism, all these kinds of things. So tailor your argument to engage with those real world context areas. When you propose to solve a problem or when you propose to create a change, your reasoning should be guided by analysis comments that focus the impacts of your topic onto specific context areas. And we will learn how to tailor our analysis comments at the end of a paragraph, and we will learn which context areas might be best for our topic, but we need to keep the full picture in mind as we're making steps toward that goal. So purpose and audience is something that we can start tackling today. Context is growing for us and it will become more clear soon enough. But overall, we're trying to make real world impacts. We're trying to solve problems and make changes and persuade that next reader to join us in our point of view. So again, we're going to recap a little bit that rhetorical relationship. Your course topic should enter into a relationship between yourself, your audience, and consequences within the world that we all share. When you think about your eventual viewpoint and argument and what it means, the meaning that you want to communicate is partly reliant on the content that you write, the words that you actually write, but it's also heavily influenced by your own purpose, the context that you're engaging with, and the audience that will eventually read your work. Your form and style of how you present your content will play a significant role in helping you express your views, and like communicate the meaning that you wish to communicate. Sorry, my words got all jumbled up there. But when we're thinking in the project proposal, when we're thinking about proposing the eventual rhetorical situation, we do need to consider what kind of form and style will carry my meaning effectively. You need to be emphasizing your own purpose. So what problem are you trying to solve and what change are you trying to bring about needs to be in the forefront, motivating the choice of ideas that you share. The final analysis or the direction that you're aiming for should be connected to how does this topic matter for real people in real life? Where does this issue fit within larger systems and larger structures? And then who am I speaking to? Keeping your audience in mind. How might those people respond to my viewpoints? How can I best, I might say manipulate, but really influence is a synonym. How might I best influence and guide their reactions to my thoughts? So thinking about the rhetorical relationship as we're working towards the proposal for our research project. So that's really good. We got the heaviest bit out of the way. Let's pause here. Which of those key ideas do you maybe want to hear more about? Where is your own topic interest or your own goal fitting within that rhetorical relationship? And so far, how is your writing approach, your thinking approach, how is it coming across similar to or different from previous assignments where you've had to brainstorm a topic and think about it before you jump in? So share questions, thoughts, ideas in the discussion space on Canvas. And when you're ready, if you need to take a break, now is a good time, and join us again when you're ready to move forward. The next part of our lesson today is about this whole metaphor of taking a seat at the table, this metaphor of joining the ongoing discussion. So we do tend to use metaphors in education. I've been saying over and over, like joining a larger ongoing conversation, entering a discourse community is kind of a more advanced metaphor. I like to think of it as taking a seat at the table. And all of these metaphors help us to kind of grasp our academic expectations. So higher education students are expected to contribute to real issues by asking thoughtful questions, analyzing existing perspectives, and adding new ideas that are relevant, contextual, and provocative. Of course, we don't all already know how to do that. That is not the expectation. Instead, classes like this, like C1001, are designed to teach critical thinking and research-based writing skills in order to prepare you all for that eventual expectation. In this class, some of our key focus skills, these are our learning objectives, are to locate and evaluate complex texts representing diverse perspectives and experiences and forms of authority. Another goal for this class is to learn how to evaluate and document evidence in order to construct an argument within a variety of rhetorical situations. So now we have a really good understanding of rhetorical situations. We're going to start looking at diverse perspectives and things like that. So like I was saying before, students are not expected to know how to do these things, and that's why school exists. So we're going to learn all these processes step by step. The 3 projects that we have together are going to help train us for those experiences. And I like to use this metaphor of taking a seat at the table. And it starts through this process of checking what's already in your bag, approaching that table, listening into the discussion, finding or sometimes creating a seat for yourself, and then finally joining in to that conversation that's already happening. So we'll start right off the bat with checking what's already in your bag. We've already seen a metaphor in this class in previous learning about like unboxing our assumptions that we carry with us. But checking what's in your bag is all about self-reflection. Check in with yourself to identify your own views, your own questions, concerns, and hopes about the topic. Take accountability for your own outlook. It's time to distinguish between what I've been taught to think and what I actually choose to think. And this requires a good amount of self-evaluation. So we need to judge our pre-existing beliefs, judge our lingering ideas, and root out anything that might be harmful, inauthentic, uninformed, misinformed. It also requires a little bit of grace, strength, courage to practice the growth mindset. So acknowledging areas for flexibility, growth, and improvement. So we can unpack our thoughts and assumptions to see what we're bringing with us, what needs to be repaired, discarded, replaced, or perhaps just leave it at home, leave it in the car when you take it with you into this table, when you're arriving at the function, trying to engage with this community and get into these conversations. Maybe there's something you just need to leave with you at home. So that's a little bit of a metaphor for what we're doing this week, checking in with ourselves. And then before we can just jump into the conversation, before we could just plop ourselves down in a seat, we need to approach the table. And I think about this as taking in the scene from a distance, getting a feel for who's involved, what kinds of voices and perspectives are being represented, what kinds of voices are being excluded, who's in the spotlight versus who's in the shadows. Just sort of taking in the scene, getting a sense for how long this topic has been up for discussion. So do we have some really old folks sitting at the table? And maybe we can start to hear and overhear their major keywords or the major points that are really standing out, even without jumping in. Something that helps us with this is what I call pre-search. It doesn't involve actual research, but just tuning in our attention and our awareness to the topic when we hear or see it presented in media, in the news, in social media, in conversations, etc. We can begin pre-searching just by scrolling through search results on Google, taking in the first few pages, or the search results from OneSearch in the DVC library. Like, we don't need to read any of those sources, but if we look at the titles, the authors, the keywords that come up, we can start to approach this conversation and get to see who's there and what they're talking about. Another way to do this, pretty old school, pretty almost revolutionary in these days, walking through the shelves of the library. So asking the librarian, like, hey, do you guys have resources on this topic? I'd like to see what you have. And then just sort of lingering at that bookshelf for a little while and look at the books, the titles, the authors' names, things that have been collected about your topic. So just as we begin to approach from a distance, we can start to notice patterns that appear amongst dates, authors, thinkers, organizations or corporations, institutions, key phrases. And this just helps us to preview the overall context of the discussion. Once we're feeling all right, like we're okay in this space, we can start getting closer and listening into the discussion at maybe one particular table. And the way we do this is through research. So this is not this project, but the next one, it's coming. Researching a mixed variety of perspectives and media, older and newer questions and ideas, academic, professional, commercial, popular perspectives, print, audio, video, imagery, artifacts, observations, behaviors, primary sources in which somebody is directly sharing their experience, giving testimony, creating artworks and expressions, or secondary sources where people are making arguments based on outside evidence that they have synthesized, that they have researched. Making sure that we have voices from multiple groups with attention to whose voices are most prominent and voices who have been underrepresented or excluded. That's when it comes time to actually shove open space. Creating space at the table is often needed when we notice that there are underrepresented or excluded perspectives. Listening to the discussion means doing this research, carefully reading, taking notes, and noticing patterns and trends where voices are asking similar questions, where voices are taking different approaches from one another, or whether we see change over time or change from one context lens to another. It's important during the research phase, during the listening in, to comprehend the messages closely, infer the unspoken patterns and hidden assumptions, evaluate that rhetorical situation. So what was this purpose of this source? Who did the author think that they were writing to? What was the intended audience? What context lenses are they engaging with? Things like that. Analyzing the real world consequences, and then asking follow-up questions. Understanding what the conversation is all about and how this community interacts sets us up to understand how we fit in. And that brings us to finding our seat, or sometimes creating our seat at the table. Connecting with the ongoing discussion is sort of how you know where you want to sit. How you know where you want to sit. Like, you don't want to sit with the opponent's side of the table. You kind of want to sit near the people who are connected with you. And the way you can do this in your learning process is when you take notes that make space for your own thoughts, ideas, and responses along the way. So along with recording what their point of view is, use this space to begin to accept, reject, negotiate, and shift the discussion. Put down connections that you see to other sources, aha moments that spark to mind when you're reading or watching or listening, questions that come to mind, and just ideas that spark up within you belong inside your notes. So when you're taking notes from this lesson, when you're taking notes from your textbook readings, when you're taking notes from the research sources that you eventually find, make space in those notes for your own words, for your own voice, because those private little responses along the way lay the foundation for where you find yourself within the conversation. And then finding where you fit in really just means joining your voice alongside views that you accept. So saying, oh, I agree with what I found here, and I want to add. Remember, we need to contribute something that is contextual, valuable, and provocative, if it can be. So saying, from my point of view, I can add this kind of evidence, this kind of reasoning, this kind of analysis to keep pushing that conversation forward. Also, finding where you fit in involves critiquing and undermining views that you reject. So disproving and invalidating those people's claims by showing the hidden assumptions that you find to be toxic or harmful, by showing the long-term consequences that you find to be unacceptable. It can also mean negotiating with views that you want to modify, put limits on, or expand upon. So maybe you've heard some viewpoints and you want to say, like, this is okay, but when their reasoning gets to this point, I think we need to see it differently. Or you can say, this is a really good argument on, like, in this context. But when you go out to other contexts or other perspectives, that argument doesn't fit. It's not a one size fits all. Instead, let me propose this. And then also just expanding upon things, making space to bring in alternate views and alternate perspectives. And then finally, shifting the discussion. So saying like, this discussion is really great. It's getting us really good momentum for to talk about psychology. But what if we take those ideas and sort of use them to talk about politics and power structures? So sort of shifting to begin a different context along that discussion. So all in all, student writers are in an actually pretty powerful position to introduce new angles, new critiques, and new perspectives into these ongoing conversations. A lot of these conversations consist of older viewpoints that by now are a little tired, a little played out. Sometimes they came up with some great idea 10 years ago, but now that's just common sense. So younger people, or like people who are entering into the conversations, regardless of your age, can kind of say like, okay, you guys are talking about this like it's so great. That's just common sense. We need to build, we need to add. What about this? What about that? So like people who are new into these spaces really bring a lot of powerful energy with them, bringing these fresh perspectives. So definitely embrace that and lean into it as you're doing your research, like lifting up other voices to say like, oh, our whole generation has really great input. We need to join this conversation. It can be really fun. I mean, for if you're an English nerd like me. So finally, the golden moment, joining the conversation. The way this works, the way this looks is firstly demonstrating your understanding. So summarizing what you learned through that research process, through that listening in, making references to key ideas and key voices. Synthesizing the discussion. So this is when we outline general patterns and connections that we've noticed. So when we notice, oh, there's a trend going on where many voices agree about this. There's a trend going on where many voices are asking this question. There's a trend going on where some people in this community go this way and some people go that way. Some people think this is the main problem. Other people think this is the main problem. Which camp am I in? Some people say we have a solution here, a solution here, a solution here. What are the merits and the drawbacks of each of those solutions? And if I were to choose one, what would I choose? So synthesizing, drawing those connections and patterns that you've noticed, showing that you can see where people are coming together, where there's disagreement, and where there's differing context lenses. And then analyzing the key viewpoints. So again, you're spending a lot of energy understanding and unpacking the conversation that you are about to enter. So explaining the deeper meaning and the consequences of those people's arguments, using different quotations from your readings to really support that you understand and you have thought deeply about this discussion. And then finally responding where you get to introduce your viewpoint within that larger context, within that dialogue of the voices that you have encountered. So the cherry on top after all that academic work that you did is now you are in a position to enter on a equal footing with these other voices and say, I know I'm new, I know I just sat down at this table, but I do understand what's going on, and this is where I can contribute my voice. So a lot of times when we're early in our college career, we feel like originality, individuality, and independence are these key values. But really what's more valuable is to recognize the context around you. We see this a lot when we stereotype about teenagers and kids, and we say like, oh, they're the center of their own universe, or they haven't learned self-awareness yet. But now, as we are becoming older adults and as we are doing higher level adult education, it's less important to say, I have an original idea. Instead, we want to say, I recognize that I'm joining into a larger context and I have a valuable contribution to add. So it's just a little bit more mature type of academic work. There's one more here. Oh yeah. Sorry, my computer keeps like crashing out. when you are finally getting to introduce your viewpoint into the discussion, really taking the care to clearly unpack your reasoning for why you're sitting at the seat that you're sitting in, so why you've joined the side that you're joining, etc. So kind of saying like, I understand the conversation, here's what I have to contribute, and I'm going to help you understand from my point of view. So that they're more likely to accept you into the discussion. Bringing in supporting evidence to really validate your own views. And that can come from experiences that you have had. It can come from information that you found through research, and it can come from linking your view with other views that are already accepted. So that can be a powerful way to support your argument, is to say, I see what you guys are saying here. I agree with these people who you all think are so smart and awesome. Like, you let them into your club, and I agree with them. So obviously I belong here. It's just kind of a technique for entering into the discourse. And all of that process from beginning to end really helps you own your seat at the table with confidence, which can be difficult as a student writer. So today you're not expected to know how to do all of these things. That's what the point of taking this course is. So by the end of this course, once we've practiced this whole process, you'll be better prepared to go through those steps again in quicker and more high pressure environments in your other classes. So is this the time for pausing? Because that was a lot. A moment for pause. Keeping in mind the context. So project 1 is all about checking in with what's in your bag and approaching the tables. Project 2 is all about like approaching the tables, listening in, and finding or creating your seat. Project 3, which is the argument, is all about finding or creating your seat and then joining that conversation. So that's where we're headed. We're learning a lot already. We've already learned how students are expected to engage with writing in the context of higher education. We've looked a little bit at using AI tools to help along the partner along the way with the writing journey. We've looked at understanding what critical thinking is, what kinds of habits and ideas that we can practice to improve our own critical thinking. And hopefully everybody has chosen, 5 or 6 practices that they really want to lean into throughout the course here. We've looked at a little bit already how to create a paragraph that features your own personal experience and your own personal connection. We learned a lot today about entering into that rhetorical situation. We learned a lot today about how our voice can fit into a larger conversation involving research, thinking about how we're going to interact with our audience. The reading after this will help us understand even more how we can help to persuade and engage with our audience. And next week, we'll take a deep dive into understanding the connection to context, and into like evaluating the quality of ideas. So we're well on our way. For now, take a look back at your notes and share in thoughts, questions, and ideas in the discussion space on Canvas. And then we're going to conclude with kind of just our final commentary about synthesis and response, which are these 2 academic techniques that we should be able to discuss without the use of metaphors. Of course, metaphors can help us when we're being introduced to new concepts. And I've used the metaphors of joining the discussion, entering a community, taking a seat at the table. But really what we're doing here is synthesizing and responding to research. So when we synthesize is when we're making connections and seeing patterns across multiple sources. When we respond, we're adding our own details, critique, analysis, and argument into that larger context of existing sources. So it can just be helpful to bring in some more clear language after digging through a lot of metaphors. So I want to leave us today with a reminder for follow-up and preparation, complete the alternative viewpoints discussion on Canvas. This is where you're firstly sharing, here's my topic, here's my kind of take on it. Please share an alternate take. So you're asking for alternate views. And then also you're contributing, so you're reading your classmates' topics and you're sort of proposing alternative views for them as well. We also have our drafting journal where we are building upon the writing practice that we did earlier. We're going to come away with 2 to 4 rough draft paragraphs that are connected to your personal connections, possible research perspectives, and also the rhetorical situation that didn't save on here. Having some technical fun today. So thank you as we leave. Thank you to our learning leaders. Please remember to share your thoughts in the Google Doc by the end of the week. Do remember that everybody is responsible for taking their own individual notes, and please use the lesson replies as a space to ask questions, share thoughts, ideas, etc. After this lesson, I do encourage you to review the prompt. So each time we learn a new chunk of concepts and ideas, it is helpful to go back and review the assignment because we can understand it in more detail. And you can always keep adding questions to the Q&A. You can get in contact with me and just let me know what your questions are. And then remember to read chapter 3 because this will help build more techniques for expressing opinions academically through clear language and clear thought patterns. So I thank you all and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.